Good morning or good afternoon, whichever it is. We're going to start with our first passage in Beowulf. We're skipping the first 85, 86 lines so that we can get right to the action. Those first lines are, in fact, more about Northern European history and different things that popular characters had done and historical characters had done. And so we're going to jump forward to about line 85, where we meet our first monster in this story. And that monster is Grendel. So we're going to read the passage together. For this first one, I'm going to discuss the answers of the questions with you, but then as we move farther through the reading, while we'll read together, you will be answering those questions more and more independently. On these assignments where I've got the embedded text with the questions, you will always know whether there's something you have to fill in because there will be a shaded box of some color. In this case, it's blue. So everywhere there is a shade, you need to fill in information. Also, when you answer the questions, you must use complete sentences. If you have an incomplete sentence, you will lose half credit no matter how correct your answer is. So let's get started with our first passage. Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings. How the Almighty had made the earth, a gleaming plain girded with waters. In his splendor he set the sun and the moon to be the earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with branches and leaves, and quickened life, every other thing that moved upon the earth. All right, so we start off with our first question, and there are a number of different translations of this, and each one has its own places where it's stronger and weaker. This one isn't quite as clear based on the question you need to answer. Even monsters have motives for their actions. They have reasons they do things. What causes Grendel to attack the first time? Here the word was translated harrowed, but a lot of other translators said it caused him pain or hurt him. If we say it hurt him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall. It's not just the loud music, it's what they're singing about. They're singing about the creation story in the Christian tradition. Grendel, who we establish right up here at the top, is a demon. And therefore, any singing about the Christian God's creation or any of that is going to cause him pain. So you should be able to answer that now based on what we've just said using your own sentence. Pause this until you get that answered on your own copy. All right, so let's move on. We're jumping back into the story here. And here it's about the Danish people, and they've been celebrating, which causes Grendel harm. They don't know about Grendel yet. We're going back into seeing what happens with them. So times were pleasant for the people there, until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marshes, marauding round the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among his kin, the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, the eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder, because the Almighty made him anathema. And out of the curse of his exile there sprang from his descendants ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too, who now strove with God time and again, until he gave them their reward. Grendel was part of this group of monsters descended from Cain. So after nightfall, Grendel set out for the lofty house to see how the ring-danes were settling into it after their drink. It doesn't make it as clear here. Grendel is a descendant of Cain, and Cain and Abel of the biblical tradition were the first sons of Adam and Eve in the Genesis tradition. Cain was jealous of his brother, and he rose up and struck his brother down and killed his brother, thereby being the first murderer in the biblical tradition. And so God cursed Cain and put a curse on Cain as a punishment, is what the biblical tradition says. And that he put a mark on him so that other humans would not harm or kill him. So Cain would have to live with his guilt. Our storyteller has merged the pagan tradition of monsters with the Christian tradition of Cain and Abel. Monsters exist in the earth because they are descendants of Cain, who was cursed by God. So in a sense, even though Grendel is a monster, he's also descended from humans. He is also human as well. So, where does Grendel live? He lives haunting the marshes, the swamps. Grendel's cursed by God. I just explained that. That whole, he's a descendant of Cain, of the biblical tradition, who killed his brother Abel. And the whole family line is cursed. Which tradition does that come from? We discussed that already. What is the name of the Danish mead hall? It means the hall of the stag. Hint, footnotes and side notes are important. So here we have our footnotes. And this is the footnote you want to look at for the name of the mead hall, which means hall of the stag. Be sure to use complete sentences. Now this one, look back at our notes on Beowulf we took and examine lines 106 through 114. This is an example of what literary element? Okay, so 106 through is talking about Cain and Abel and how God cursed Cain, but they're not doing as much of explaining. This is actually an allusion to the biblical tradition, which is the literary element that we learned. Allusion. Let's move on. If you need to pause for a moment to finish answering the questions, you can pause the video. But we're going to move on. So after nightfall, Grendel set out for that lofty house, Heorot, to see how the Ring-Danes were settling into it after their drink. And there he came upon them, a company of the best, asleep from their feasting, insensible to pain and human sorrow. Suddenly then the God-cursed brute was creating havoc, greedy and grim. He grabbed 30 men from their resting places and rushed back to his lair, flushed up and inflamed from the raid, blundering back with the butchered corpses. Then, as dawn brightened and the day broke, Grendel's powers of destruction were plain. Their wassail, celebration, was over. They wept to heaven and mourned under mourning. Their mighty prince, the storied leader, sat stricken and helpless, humiliated by the loss of his guard, bewildered and stunned, staring aghast at the demon's trail, in the deep distress. He was numb with grief, but got no respite, for one night later merciless Grendel struck again with more gruesome murders. Malignant by nature, he never showed remorse. It was easy then to meet with a man, moving himself to a safer distance, to bed in the bothies. For who could be blind to the evidence of his eyes, the obliviousness of that hall watcher's hate? Whoever escaped kept the weather eye open and moved away. And so Grendel ruled in defiance of right, one against all, against the greatest house in the world, until the greatest house in the world stood empty, a deserted wallstead. For 12 winter seasons of woe, all were endangered, young and old, were hunted down by that dark death shadow, who lurked and swooped in the long nights on the misty moors. Nobody knows where these reavers from hell roam on their errands. And so Grendel waged his lonely war, inflicting constant cruelties on the people, atrocious hurt. He took over Heorot, haunted the glittering hall after dark, but the throne itself, the treasure seat, he was kept from approaching. He was the Lord's outcast. Who is king of the Danes, and why can't Grendel kill this king? Well, we see here in this side note that is King Hrothgar. King Hrothgar. And he's faced with this situation where he can't beat this monster, and his men can't win against this monster, and this monster sneaks up on him at night and when they're asleep. Grendel's character is very cowardly, which is meant to mimic the cowardice of his ancestor Cain, who the legend when he killed his brother Abel, that he actually did it from behind, that he actually snuck up on him. Soldiers start going elsewhere to sleep, but Grendel can't kill the king. He can't touch the king. And it's not real clear here, but Grendel can go in. He can attack anybody in there. It says the throne itself, the treasure seat, he was kept from approaching. It's not necessarily the physical throne seat that the king sits on. It is the king himself. This is again working with that good versus evil thing. The king represents good. Grendel represents evil. The king, who is representing good, cannot be touched because he is God's representative by divine right of kings. That goes back to your history classes. He can't be touched by this monster who is evil because he's protected by God. King of the Danes is Hrothgar, and Grendel cannot kill the king because God is protecting the king. How many years does Grendel engage in blood feud? Scroll back up. 12 winters, seasons of woe. Many of these northern cultures measure their years by winters because that was the big, hard season to get through. So they measured by how many winters? 12 winters. And that is our first passage that we needed to cover. We'll move on to the next passage, and which is the coming of Beowulf, here shortly. Make sure you've answered using complete sentences, and then submit this document when you have completed it.